Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, una pequeña introducción a Richard.
Well, I'd like to introduce Richard Smith. I believe it's interesting to stress that one of the goals of Aapresid is to defend sustainability. As part of this activity, we believe that one of the problems we are trying to find solutions to is the problem of weeds. Not everything is related to chemical control, herbicides. We believe there are other tools available, and when trying to find new tools to expand our knowledge, to defend ourselves and being able to fight against weeds, we believe we need a more comprehensive approach, and I believe Richard will help us out here. So, Richard, welcome. Thank you, and the floor is yours. So now I will read Richard Smith's CV. He's an associate professor at New Hampshire University in the U.S. He has a doctorate degree in plant biology from Michigan University. He's an associate editor for peer-reviewed journals, one related to agriculture, one related to food systems. So, Mr. Smith, the floor is yours.
Buenos días. Can you hear me okay?
Buenos días, ¿me escuchan?
I'd like to say that I am
Quisiera decirles
very, very happy to be here in the beautiful city of Rosario
de estar en esta hermosa
to
ciudad
speak with you
de
today.
Rosario.
And I would like to
Para
thank
dar-
the
antes de
organizers of this
quisiera
meeting
agradecer a
for
los
inviting me here.
organizadores por
I'm very
invitarme.
grateful to be here with
Les
you.
agradezco mucho por
And I
esta
want to
oportunidad.
apologize that I do
Quiero
not
pedirles
speak
disculpas
Spanish.
por no hablar
Um,
español.
And lastly, I would like to thank the translators
Finalmente
who
quiero
I think are doing a
agradecerles
very,
a
very
las
wonderful
traductoras que creo
job.
que
So
están
I will try to
haciendo un muy buen
speak
trabajo. Voy a tratar
slowly
de hablar
to make your job
lentamente
easier.
para que les resulte más fácil.
One of the speakers yesterday
Uno de los oradores de
talked
ayer
about
habló sobre
viewing old
la
problems
importancia de
with a new
considerar
perspective.
los problemas antiguos desde
And
una
that's
nueva
what I want to
perspectiva.
do today. I want to present a new perspective on how we might think about weeds and weed management in conservation agriculture systems. So this is the title of my presentation, which is a little bit different than what's in the program. And so in terms of an outline for today's talk,
En cuanto a los puntos que voy a tratar en mi presentación,
I want to first give an overview of the principles of conservation agriculture, which we are all familiar with, and then present a paradox, the paradox of weed management in conservation agriculture systems, because it's very difficult to manage weeds in these systems. Then I want to present a new framework, a new way of thinking about weeds in the context of their ecology and in the context of the ecological process of succession. Then we'll talk about two factors that I think are most important when we think about weeds in the context of succession: disturbance and the availability of resources. And with that framework, then we can begin to think about conservation agriculture systems. We can think about our own conservation agriculture systems. And for the farmers here, you can think about where your conservation agriculture system might fit into the framework that I will explain in a minute. And then I will finish up with two very simple, I think simple, but very eloquent examples that I think prove some of the points that I'm going to try to make today. So, the principles of conservation agriculture, we're all familiar with these, right? Maintain soil cover. This can be dead crop residues or living cover crops.
vivos o cultivos de cobertura
rotate
vivos,
our crops,
utilizar
crop
la rotación de
rotation,
cultivos,
and then plant
y
with
después
minimal or no soil disturbance.
moviendo, alterando,
Interestingly,
moviendo mínimamente el suelo,
these
o sin
principles
removerlo. Estos
of
principios
conservation agriculture
de la
are
agricultura
also
de conservación
the core
también
principles
son los
of
principios
integrated weed
básicos
management.
de una gestión integrada de malezas.
For example, this idea of maintaining soil cover.
La idea de mantener
We
la
know
cobertura del suelo.
that residues
Sabemos que los
and cover
residuos
crops
y los
suppress
cultivos de
weed
cobertura
emergence through a
suprimen la
variety
emergencia de
of mechanisms,
malezas a través de diferentes
including
mecanismos, y esto incluye
competition,
las competencias
competition for
por los
space,
recursos,
competition for light,
competencia por el espacio,
competition
por
for
la
soil
luz,
resources.
por los recursos del
We
suelo.
know that this cover can lead to allelopathic interference. So those are phytochemicals, chemicals produced by the plant that can suppress weeds. And we also know that maintaining cover provides habitat for organisms that are beneficial to weed management, organisms that attack and kill weeds or kill weed seeds in the soil.
o las semillas de las malezas.
In terms of crop rotation,
En cuanto a rotación,
another pillar
cultivos,
of conservation
otro de los
agriculture,
pilares de la
crop
agricultura de
rotation is
conservación,
important for weed management because it
la rotación es
disrupts the life
importante
cycle
para
of different weeds,
la gestión de malezas, porque
particularly
altera el
if
ciclo
the
de vida
crops
de
that are
muchos
being
malezas,
rotated are very
especialmente
different
si los
from one
cultivos que se
another.
van rotando son muy diferentes
It
entre
also
sí.
increases the diversity of stress
La
and
rotación
mortality factors. It
permite
weakens
aumentar la intensidad de factores de
weeds.
estrés y mortalidad.
Crop
que
rotation
debilitan a las
diversifies
malezas.
selection
La rotación de
pressures,
cultivos
particularly if we're
diversifica las
talking
presiones de
about
selección,
herbicides.
especialmente si hablamos de herbicidas.
And crop rotation increases the opportunity to incorporate many different approaches to weed management. This idea of many little hammers, which maybe some of you have heard of this concept. So crop rotation is important for integrated weed management. And lastly, planting with minimal soil disturbance. We know that soil disturbance stimulates weed emergence from the soil seed bank. And we also know that if we don't disturb the soil, then we conserve weed seed predator populations, those beneficial organisms that attack weed seeds. And we also conserve these allelopathic zones, these zones of chemicals that suppress weeds near the soil surface. And the soil surface in a no-till system, for example, that's where the majority of the weed seeds are, so that's a good
cerca de las
thing.
superficies donde están la mayoría de las semillas de malezas.
And so the paradox,
La
then,
paradoja es la
what is this
siguiente.
paradox? So the principles of conservation
Los principios de
agriculture
agricultura de conservación
are also the core
también son
principles
los
of
principios
integrated
centrales
weed
de la gestión
management,
integrada de
both of
malezas.
which we practice to hopefully improve the
Manejos
environmental
los utilizamos para
impact of
mejorar el
agriculture.
impacto ambiental de la agricultura.
So they're the same principles, yet
Entonces, los mismos son los
weed
mismos
pressure
principios, sin embargo, la
tends to
presión
be
de
higher
malezas tiende a ser
in conservation
más
agriculture
alta
systems.
en
It's
un
more
sistema
difficult
de agricultura
to
de
manage
conservación. Es más
weeds
difícil
in conservation
manejar
agriculture
y
systems
controlar las malezas en estos
where these
sistemas
principles are not followed.
cuando no se cumplen. Que cuando no se cumplen estos
And
principios.
this difficulty
Además,
in managing
esta
weeds in these
dificultad del
systems
manejo de las
is one of the
malezas en los
things that
sistemas es uno
limits the
de
wider
los
spread
factores que
adoption
limita
of
la
conservation
adopción más
agriculture.
generalizada de la agricultura de conservación.
Additionally,
Además,
conservation agriculture
la
systems
agricultura-
tend to
la
be
agricultura de conservación
highly
en general
reliant on herbicides. right?
utiliza
So
mucho
this
los
pillar
herbicidas,
of no
este
soil
pilar
disturbance or
de
minimum soil disturbance, that
remoción,
pillar
movimiento mínimo
of
del
conservation
suelo, ese pilar de
agriculture is
agricultura
being
de
held up
conservación,
in
se
large part
logra en gran
by the use
parte
of herbicides.
a través del uso de herbicidas.
And we know there are some problems with using herbicides, some environmental problems and some agronomic problems, including herbicide-resistant weeds. Right? So the more we use a specific herbicide or herbicide with the same mode of action, the more likely we are to develop herbicide-resistant weeds. There's obvious economic costs associated with herbicides, and then there are other environmental costs associated with herbicides as well in terms of pollution. In the United States, we know a lot about herbicide resistance. Here's some data on glyphosate resistance. We have 17 biotypes, weed biotypes that are resistant to glyphosate. So we're winning. We're winning in the United States in terms of these numbers. But Argentina, you are close. You're very close behind. You have 9. And our neighbors in Brazil are right behind you. Right? So herbicide-resistant weeds are an important problem and a serious problem in a lot of our conservation agriculture systems in the United States, here in Brazil, and in other parts of the world, here in Argentina, sorry. And some of the solutions to dealing with these glyphosate-resistant weeds in the United States, we're seeing problems with those as well. And so one of the potential solutions that has been offered is the use of older herbicide chemistries, right? New crops that you can apply dicamba, for example. And we're seeing an emergence of problems associated with the use of dicamba in these new dicamba-resistant soybeans. And so, on one hand, we have conservation agriculture with the goal of improving the environmental impacts of agriculture. Those principles of conservation agriculture are the same principles of integrated weed management, yet weeds are more difficult to control in these systems oftentimes. Right? So this is the paradox. And today, I want to argue that to address this paradox, to manage this paradox, we need to better understand the ecological role of weeds in agroecosystems. We need to understand how our agricultural practices impact the drivers that affect weed abundance and growth, the factors that affect weed abundance and growth, and the roles that practices that are bundled or intertwined with conservation agriculture might play in undermining robust weed control. So let's think about weeds in a different way. This might be an old way of thinking about weeds, but I think it's something we've maybe gotten away from or forgotten. What are weeds? Weeds are the first stage, the first phase of an ecological process called succession. Right? And so succession is a change in a plant community over time following a disturbance. Right? So this is, you might have learned this in an ecology class in high school or in college. Right? So succession, the change in a plant community over time after a disturbance. And in agricultural systems, it looks something like this, right? Some sort of disturbance is used that creates bare soil. Maybe it's tillage. Maybe it's an application of glyphosate. And as soon as that happens, the process of succession begins. Right? And the first stage of that process of succession is colonization by weeds. Right? Annual weeds. Weeds with an annual life cycle are the first to colonize. And if there is no more disturbance, then the next stage is those become increasingly colonized by perennial weeds. Perennial weeds begin to outcompete the annuals. And if you follow this through time, then eventually the plant community would come to resemble a grassland or a forest, whatever the native ecosystem might be. But that would take some amount of time, many years. But the point is, these first stages of succession are the annual and perennial weeds that we spend so much of our time, so much of our money, so much of our effort trying to manage in agriculture, right? And any subsequent disturbance, again, whether it's tillage or herbicides, starts the process all over, right? Reinitiates succession. And so disturbance is key in this process, right? So let's talk more about disturbance. Here's another way to think about it. Right? I like to use graphs like this to think about these ideas. Disturbance creates bare soil. So now we've created some bare soil here, right? In this case, it was tillage. It could have been an application of herbicide. And immediately we've started the process of succession. So before I go on, this is to remind me that I want to clarify by what I mean by bare soil. What I mean is that the plants are no longer growing on a given area of land. It could be because of tillage. It could be because of cultivation later in the season or the application of herbicides. It might be in strips, it might be in a small portion, or it might be the entire field. But in all cases, competition from existing vegetation has been reduced or eliminated. Okay, so that's what I mean by bare soil, because I'm going to use that term quite a bit. All right, so we've had disturbance that creates bare soil, and immediately we've initiated the process of succession. All right? So now weeds begin to establish and grow rapidly, primarily from the soil seed bank, the seeds that are already in the soil. You can see that there's already weeds in this field. Right? I drew those weeds, but... And if we allow the process to continue, then we're going to have more weeds over time. Right? The weeds are going to get bigger. There will be more that will establish. Species will begin to turn over. Right? These annual weeds are going to transition to a perennial weed community if we give it enough time. And eventually, this accrual of biomass, this increase in weed biomass and weed abundance will begin to slow. But we never get to that point in agriculture, right? So disturbance is key. Weeds are just early successional plant species. There's nothing special about weeds. Weeds are the first stage of succession. And each agricultural disturbance reinitiates or begins this process of succession. So just an example of a real example to show you what I mean. So these two plots were tilled and then left fallow. The plot on the left was tilled 3 months before the photo was taken, and the plot on the right was tilled 10 months before that photo was taken. Right? So we initiated succession. This is succession. Right? Those plots are full of weeds. We did not plant a crop after we tilled. We just tilled and let succession happen. That's a lot of weeds. Right? So that's what I'm talking about. But that's not what we want. We don't want a plot full of weeds. Right? We don't want to be anywhere on this curve. Right? We certainly don't want to be here. We don't want to be here either, right? Because that means we have weeds. We don't want weeds. Right? So we manage for this point, right? The 0 point in terms of weed biomass, where we have no weeds. That's what we manage for. We manage for the initial state of succession, where we have no weeds. We manage for this. This is what we want to see. We want to see crops too, but we don't want to see weeds. We manage for bare soil.
Hacemos un manejo para mantener en este estado el suelo desnudo.
Which requires disturbance, right? It requires additional disturbance to maintain the soil in a state of initial succession, right? We want the crops, but we don't want anything else, right? So it takes additional disturbance to have it look like that. And it takes additional disturbance every season, right? Again, maybe that's cultivation. More likely it's herbicides. But those are disturbances. Otherwise, it would look like this. Or more precisely, it would look like this. So this looks terrible. But this plot was plowed, so this is not a conservation ag system, right? So we moldboard, we plowed it, and then we planted maize, corn. But we applied no other weed control, right? This is not recommended. No farmer would want to do this. And this is what you get. You get maize and weeds. Now, if we did not want it to look like this, we would have to have applied an additional disturbance, right? Herbicide or cultivation or what have you, right? If we did not want it to look like this. Here's another example, right? This is in another field. Maize and weeds. No additional disturbance was applied, so it looks like this. We have initiated succession. In this case, it's succession in the form of Chenopodium album, which is the dominant weed in this field. The picture I showed you before was succession in the form of Amaranthus retroflexus, the dominant weed in that field. So the point I'm trying to make is that we use disturbance, whether that's tillage or herbicides, to prepare the soil for planting. That disturbance initiates the ecological process of succession because we've created bare soil. And weeds are the initial stage of succession on bare soil. They are early successional plant species, right? That's what weeds are. We then need additional weed management to maintain that soil in a bare state, right? Obviously, We want the crop, but we want the rest of the soil around the crop to be free of weeds. And that additional weed management is a disturbance, right? And that disturbance reinitiates the process of succession, which takes us back to the former point, right? And weeds are this initial stage of succession. And so what we have, in essence, then, is a positive feedback loop where we use disturbance to prepare the seedbed, and that disturbance initiates the ecological process of succession. This leads to weed emergence, because weeds are the first stage of succession. Because we have weed emergence, or to prevent weed emergence, requires additional weed control, which, as we know, is a disturbance. Right? So, a positive feedback loop, which results in a never-ending cycle of needing to manage the weeds that we have basically created. Right? So weeds are really a symptom of how we conduct agriculture. Agriculture is really just a collection of disturbances, right? Managed disturbances. And weeds are a result of that. And of course, then, the more weeds that we have, and the more weed control that we apply, the more likely it is that we are going to have environmental impacts associated with that weed control, right? Including herbicide resistance, environmental pollution, erosion, and loss of beneficial organisms. So the more weeds we have, the more impacts, the more environmental consequences we're going to see. All right, so that was disturbance, right? Disturbance is key to all of this, to this new idea, this new way of thinking about weeds in conservation agriculture systems. Let's talk next about resources, the resources that are available to weeds. Weeds are plants, right? And all plants, all weeds require light, they require water, and they require nutrients from the soil. They also require space, a place to establish their roots. And when we think about our conservation agriculture systems, or agriculture systems in general, these tend to be places where these resources are very highly abundant. So here's some no-till soybean that obviously followed no-till corn. And you can see that there is a lot of light available. There's probably a lot of moisture in the soil. There's probably a lot of nutrients in the soil, and there's plenty of space, right? So the resources that weeds require are typically in very high abundance in both conventional agriculture systems as well as conservation agriculture systems. And so if we go back to this curve, right, the way that I like to think about succession and weeds, one thing to point out is that the slope of that curve, right, the slope of this curve here is telling us how fast the weeds establish, how fast they grow, how fast they reproduce to produce new seeds that then go back into the seed bank, into the soil. Right? So the slope of that curve depends on the availability of resources, both during and after that disturbance event that resets succession. Right? So if resources are high, so there's a lot of resources available, then that slope is going to be steeper, meaning there will be more weeds. The weeds that are there are going to grow faster because they have the resources that they need. They might reproduce faster, they might produce more seeds. Right? Conversely, if the availability of resources is lower, right, low resource availability, then we would expect a lower slope. Right? There should be fewer weeds. The weeds that are there will grow slower. They may produce fewer weed seeds, etc. Does that make sense so far? And so, when we think about resources, and we think about disturbance, then really these two factors interact. Right? They interact to determine weed pressure. They interact to determine how many weeds we should have in a field. Of course, there's other factors, right? How many seeds are in the seed bank, in the soil, things like that. But these are the two big factors, I would argue. And so, where disturbance is high and resource availability is high, we should expect to have the highest weed pressure. And where disturbance is low and resource availability is low, we should expect to have the lowest weed pressure. And if we have low weed pressure, this then should result in less need for weed control, right? Lower need for weed control, and therefore lower impacts on the environment in terms of potential for developing herbicide resistance or pollution, etc., etc. Okay, so that's the framework. That's the framework for thinking about weeds in agricultural systems in general. So let's use this new way of thinking to diagnose or to consider conservation agriculture systems in particular. So the first thing we need to recognize then is that conservation agriculture practices involve some level of disturbance to the soil. Even no-till involves some level of disturbance to the soil. Right? Here's some pictures of different conservation agriculture, conservation tillage practices, including strip till, as well as no-till there in the corner. right? We've got strip till, different forms of conservation tillage. And you can see that all of them have varying degrees in which they result in soil disturbance. Here's a ranking of the different types of conservation tillage, right? Everything except moldboard plow would be potentially considered conservation tillage, along a gradient of decreasing intensity and frequency of soil disturbance. And you can see that no-till is here at the end, so it has the least amount of soil disturbance, but it's not zero, right? There's still some level of soil disturbance. So that's the first point to recognize about conservation agriculture systems. They involve some level of disturbance. The second point to remember is that most conservation agriculture systems, do not address the resources available to weeds any better than conventional systems do. Right? There's still a lot of space, there's still a lot of light, there's still a lot of nutrients in the soil that are available to weeds, either during the time the crop is growing or after the crop has been harvested or before the crop has been planted. Right? There's still a lot of resources available in our conservation ag systems. These are just two pictures of no-till crops, corn, soybean, and you can see, right, there's a lot of resources potentially available. And so we can take these ideas of resource availability and disturbance and build a conceptual model illustrating how these two factors, disturbance and resource availability, interact to determine the weed management challenge that we might see in any given conservation agriculture system. Now, obviously, where disturbance is high and where resource availability is high, that's where we're going to find the highest weed abundance and the greatest challenge in terms of weed management and weed control. Right? That's where we don't want to be. We don't want to be there. That's the worst of both worlds, right? Conversely, if disturbance is high, or a great extent of the soil is being disturbed, that's going to lead to succession. But if resource availability is low, then the weeds that do establish are going to be starved of the resources that they require. And so we would expect to have an intermediate abundance of weeds in that situation, right? Because there's not enough resources to support the growth of those weeds that do establish. In the same vein, if disturbance is low, but resource availability is still very high, then again we're going to expect some intermediate level of weed abundance, because the few weeds that do establish during the process of succession are going to have all the resources they need. Right? So again, these are not ideal places to be. Right? And I'm sure we can all imagine and think of specific conservation agriculture systems that might fall into one of these three quadrants here. Right? Of course, the place that we want to be, right, where we should expect to have the lowest abundance of weeds and the fewest weed control challenges, would be where we have low disturbance, right? So we try not to initiate succession, and any weeds that do establish because of succession, do not have the resources that they require to grow and reproduce, right? That's the best of both worlds. And so the challenge for our conservation agriculture systems is to diagnose the problem, right? Is it a problem with disturbance? Is it a problem with resources? And then fix the system, right? The system. Fix at the system level, manage at the system level to move that system towards lower weed abundance. Maybe it's managing disturbance. Maybe it's managing resources better. Maybe it's managing both of those things to end up here where we want to be. So that's the idea. And I'm about to run out of time. I still have a little bit of time left. So with the last few minutes of my talk, I want to present just two examples from the literature, right? Two experimental examples that I think demonstrate how we can manage disturbance or how we can manage resources to improve weed management, right, to decrease the amount of weeds. The first example is from our neighbors in Brazil. The second example comes from Australia. And so this first example I want to talk about was published in the journal Weed Research in 2015. And it's very simple. Maybe some of you here are familiar with it. Maybe someone here contributed to this study. I think it's a fabulous study, and it's very eloquent. And so here is what they did. They observed that the standard design of the coulter, right, on the no-till seeder would create conditions where the residue would bind up. The soil and the residue would get bound up in the coulter, right? And this would create disturbance. And this would be worse the faster the planter was run. So at higher planter speeds, at higher seeder speeds, they would see even more disturbance. And so what they wanted to know is, if we create a modification, a very simple modification to the coulter disc, would that reduce the amount of residue that would bind up in there and decrease the amount of disturbance? So that's it. That's the experiment. They seeded soybean with a seeder that had the standard coulters and with these modified coulters. And then they measured weed abundance sometime after the soybean was planted. So very simple experiment. And so here's the data. On the... There it goes. Here's the data. On the left are weed density, and on the right is weed biomass. On the x-axis is seeder speed in kilometers per hour. And there are 3 graphs for each because they conducted this experiment in 3 sites in Brazil. Okay. And so I've highlighted here the line that corresponds to the modified coulters. The line in black is the standard coulters. And what you can see is that the abundance of weeds, both in terms of density and biomass, increased with increasing seeder speed. But more importantly, there was always fewer weed density, lower weed abundance, biomass, when they used the modified culture. A dramatic difference, I would say. Right? And so to summarize the results of this experiment, slower planting speed and modified culture reduced disturbance and weed emergence. Averaged across the seeding speeds, this modified culture, which reduces the disturbance, reduced weed density by 56%. That's a lot. That's really quite amazing. And, maybe even more importantly, that modified culture increased soybean grain yield by 42%, presumably because there were fewer weeds. Right? So a very, very simple change, in this case to the cedar, reduced disturbance and improved weed control dramatically. All right, so that was the first case study, first example. The second example is another one that I think is a fantastic experiment and a very simple experiment. It's an experiment that I wish I had done. I did not do it. And in this case, the researchers wondered if, by simply changing the direction that the crop rows were planted, right, the orientation of the crop rows relative to the direction of the sun, if that would reduce the light resource that is available to weeds. Would the crop capture more of the sunlight, resulting in less sunlight feeding the weeds below the crop? So they planted 5 different crops in either east-west rows, right? They were perpendicular to the direction of the sun, or in north-south rows that were parallel to the direction of the sun. They did this for 5 crops. They did this in a number of different locations in Australia, and they did this in multiple years. And so here's the results in terms of light interception, and I've highlighted the east-west rows for the different crops. And again, if there's more light interception by the crop, then there is less light available to the weeds. And so you can see that in the east-west rows for these 5 different crops, there was indeed higher light interception by the crop when they were planted in east-west rows, perpendicular with the direction of the sun, compared to when they were planted in north-south rows. Right? Now, for barley and wheat, that difference was statistically significant. Right? It's higher in the other ones, but not statistically different. So we're going to concentrate just on barley and wheat. Here are the weed biomass, so they measured weed biomass then, weed abundance, in barley and wheat and all the other crops. And you can see that in all cases, so in the different locations and in the different years, the biomass of weeds was lower when they planted the crops perpendicular to the direction of the sun. So to summarize this case study, compared to the north-south orientation, light interception in the east-west orientation was 28% higher in wheat and 18% higher in barley. And weed biomass was reduced by 51% in wheat and 37% in barley. That's pretty outstanding, right? From such a simple change, right? Just changing the direction of planting. Nothing else was done. Nothing else was different. And they saw that grain yield increased in wheat by 24% and 26% in barley. So a very simple change that addresses the resource had dramatic impacts on wheat abundance and crop yield. And so this is my final slide. Those are just two examples. They're probably the best examples because they are so simple. Right? They do not involve a dramatic change in the system. But there's many other examples of how conservation agriculture systems could be modified to address disturbance, to address resources, to address both of these factors. Some of these examples would represent dramatic changes to the cropping system. Some of these examples include things like cover crops, which I think the next talk after me is going to be about cover crops, right? You can imagine cover crops reducing the resources available to weeds, so I'm glad I did not include any cover crop examples, because I think those are going to be covered after I talk. But the point is, there is no single solution. And our weed management challenges in conservation agriculture are not going to be solved through chemistry alone, not through herbicides alone, right? We have to think differently. We have to think about the system. We have to think about resources. We have to think about disturbance. And we have to be careful not to trade one pest management challenge for a new challenge, right? We can't just swap our pests. And hopefully, this new way of thinking, which I don't think is that new, maybe an old way of thinking about weeds and thinking about disturbance and thinking about resources in our cropping systems, will give you some ideas for ways that we might improve conservation agriculture in the future. So with that, muchas gracias, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We thank Richard Smith for his presentation, and now we will start a Q&A session. Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for not being able to speak to you in English. If I had to summarize your presentation, I think we started by saying that we are here because we believe that the solution for sustainable agriculture is not related only to chemistry. I think Richard clearly showed this. He gave us two examples of what comes in the next session. So that's the general summary. So as not to waste any time, there's a question in English. I will read the question in English.
Resource for weeds in our planting system.
¿Considera usted que se puede reducir la disponibilidad de sistema, la disponibilidad de recursos para las malezas en nuestros sistemas de cultivo?
I'm not sure.
The question is on the screen. Look at the screen in front of you.
I'm not sure I understand the question. If the question is regarding... if the question is regarding how to address the availability of resources and decrease those resources, I think it's a difficult question, right? The answer is difficult because we need resources for our crop. And so the goal is to make sure that those resources that are available in our agricultural systems go to our crop, but not to the weeds, right? And so that's the challenge. And in many ways, I think I showed one example of the light resource, but the soil resources, those are another challenge. And so, for example, narrow row spacing, right, is one way to decrease the amount of resources available to weeds and hopefully maximize capture of resources by crops. So maybe but a lot of those row spacing studies where that were developed to figure out optimal row spacings, many of those were done under conditions of optimal weed control, right? And so maybe those need to be adjusted in light of using the row spacings themselves to control the weeds through resource capture. And so maybe the recommended row spacings under a weed-free condition when you're using herbicides would be very different in a system where you are not using herbicides. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But obviously another approach is cover crops, using cover crops as living mulches, so we often kill our cover crop before we plant. But if we can figure out ways to have them coexist, then the cover crop can take advantage of any available resources, and hopefully we have enough left over for the crop. That would be another example. And then lastly, there's been some really nice research done in Iowa showing that a very significant modification to a cropping system, such as going from a corn-soybean rotation, which is not really a diverse rotation. It's one of the reasons we have so many problems with weeds in the United States. Going from that rotation to a rotation that includes 2 or 3 years of perennial pasture, right, where you have the perennial pasture taking advantage of the resources and the lack of soil disturbance associated with 2 or 3 years of perennial pasture, that can have very, very dramatic changes or dramatic impacts on weed abundance as well, and the need for weed control. But that's a very drastic change to the system. But sometimes a drastic change is necessary given your goals.
Well, the next question I would add to what Richard said. Today, his presentation focused on 2 areas. He gave 2 examples of weed control, weed management. One was disturbance, and the other one was the resources we have in our crops. He said we have to work in order to reduce that. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't give those resources to the crops, but we should see how we become more efficient here. So he talked about light, the orientation regarding the sun, the amount of nutrients we were used. So he gave us examples to think of new ideas to use the resources we have in a better way. I'm sorry for the time. The next question is, would a cover crop be in the right quadrant?
The question is, would a cover crop be in the right quadrant? So the quadrant where we have the lowest weed abundance. I think that depends on how the cover crop is used. Right? If the cover crop is planted in between 2 different crops, and then we use certainly while it's growing, it's going to be capturing resources and hopefully starving weeds. But as soon as we terminate that cover crop, as soon as we kill it, then we have initiated the process of succession, right? And so then we have weeds again. So it kind of depends on how that cover crop is integrated into the system. If the cover crop is rolled, so in organic cropping systems and some other cropping systems, we're very interested in rolling cover crops, terminating them without herbicides and without tillage, but rolling them and killing them so that they stay in place and form a suppressive mulch. And sometimes that mulch might be this deep. And if you have a mulch that's that deep and that you can plant into, then it's very hard for the weeds to emerge, right? And certainly the light resource is being reduced. And if that cover crop took up a lot of soil nutrients and is storing them in its tissues, those are no longer available to the weed. And so it's a matter of how you use the cover crop and how you integrate it into the system. Nice question.
Locutor, ¿estamos con tiempo o estamos con tiempo cumplido?
Estamos con tiempo cumplido, como en el fútbol, David.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much to all of you. As it has been said, we will still deal with this issue in the next panel. Thank you very much, Richard, for your presentation.
Aquí, bueno, muchas gracias a todos.